Welcome to the Pewtercast. My name is Brent Allen, and I'm your host, and this is not episode 3. This is bonus content 1. This is the first one that we are doing that is not related to our main show. You guys may have hopefully noticed that from the title as you guys were clicking through into this episode. And guys, I'm really excited to be able to do this. You know, in our main show, we talk all about the Bucs, and this is a Tampa Bay Buccaneers podcast. That's what we talk about. We are all fans of the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. But in this segment, in this kind of special episode, we're going to get to be talking about some things that we don't necessarily normally get to talk about on the main show for one reason or another. And that is going to be maybe some interviews that we get with people, that may be some special media guests that we have on that really just what we're talking about didn't fit within the context or the topic of what we were covering in the main show. And one of the things, and you know, we're Buccaneers, we don't necessarily follow the rules all the time. We don't necessarily always have to talk about Bucs stuff. We can cover other fandoms. You guys have heard me in both of the episodes before now of kind of crossing the fandoms. I love the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, but there's lots of other stuff that I love. And so in the bonus content, guys, and I'm sure there's people out there who are not going to like this, but in the bonus content, it's not necessarily going to be completely Bucs related. Though we'll certainly, I'm sure, bring in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers into it somehow. But one of those things that is my fandom is movies. I love movies. I love getting to watch movies. I especially love comic book movies. And so with that, guys, I'm actually going to bring on a guest that I am so excited to have here today. This is a guy that you guys don't realize it, but if you're listening to this podcast, you should be thankful, and you should be on your knees thanking God that this man exists and has come along, because if it wasn't for this guy, this podcast really probably wouldn't exist. At least it would not exist in the format that it does, because his podcast, which is a great little thing called In Session Film, has impacted our podcast. It's kind of given me my first taste of what it is to be in the podcast world, and it's really helped us give the format of our show. If you listen to our show and you listen to his, there's a lot of similarities, particularly as it's formatted, particularly as the shape and the skeleton of the show goes. Now, of course, our content and the personalities that we have is completely different, and so it's not at all the same podcast, but the format, the bones of what's out there really is kind of the same. So I would like to welcome the host and the owner of In Session Film Podcast, Mr. JD Duran. JD, welcome to the show, man.
Hey, thanks for lots of kind words there. Thank you so much, Brent, for that. And glad to hear everything is up and running for you guys. And even though I'm not a Tampa Bay Buccaneers fan, I may have to be in terms of proximity, because Tampa is right down the road from where I'm at now. So.
You just moved. We're both from well, you're not from Kentucky, but we lived in Kentucky for quite a while.
Yeah.
And you are from that area. I'm going to go ahead and claim you're from Kentucky, and you're now down in Gainesville, Florida. And you're right there next to Tampa, which is awesome. Have you caught a little bit of the Bucs fever? You're running into a lot of fans there in Gainesville, or what's it like? What's it like there?
I have seen some of the the merchandise around, but I haven't felt a ton of the Buccaneers, and mostly because I think it's out of season, and right now the Lightning are in the Stanley Cup playoffs, so it's very much in hockey mode. And
you're a big hockey fan.
I'm a big hockey guy too, so perhaps I'm a little bit biased because I've paid a bit more, but I've certainly felt that, and I love Tampa as a hockey city. I love the culture of hockey in Tampa, so that's where my love for the city comes into play. But I'll be curious to check out the football culture as well, and hopefully get to see a game later on in the fall.
Yeah, there is nothing else like the Tampa Bay Buccaneer culture. It's no secret that the Tampa Bay fandom, the Tampa Bay fan base, is not necessarily the largest fan base in the NFL. It tends to be pretty contained to that area, but man, for that area and where we are, I wouldn't want to be another fan. So now, JD, with that, I know you are a football fan. There is a particular team out there. Why don't you tell us who it is that you kind of go back in the day rooting for?
Oh boy, yeah. So I am a Detroit Lions
Oh.
fan, even though
Oh.
Brent claims me from Kentucky. I'm from Michigan originally, so I grew up a Lions fan. Rough when it comes to the NFL for me, but you know what? We embrace our terribleness, and
Well, JD,
you know,
I think I
hope
got to
for the
tell you,
best.
I think you will fit really well in Tampa Bay as a fan of the Bucks. Because while I love my Tampa Bay Buccaneers, you know, the years have not always been kind to us.
Yeah.
They've really not. But hey, you know, listen, I've
Yeah.
said this on the previous episodes. We are in the process right now in Tampa of I feel like we are creating a team that is a pretty good analog of
Yeah.
what those golden years of Tampa were back in the late 90s and the early 2000s up to that Super Bowl run. And we're putting the pieces together back in place. They're shifting a culture. Our last episode 2, was all about the culture that needs to shift in Tampa to get us back to that. And what we're actually watching happen right now with Dirk Cutter as the new head coach that's in there, and Jameis Winston and the energy that he's bringing, and even what some of the other new players that are coming in. You know, we drafted Vernon Hargraves first round draft pick, and he's a Tampa boy. You know, he's born and raised in Tampa. Now he gets to go play for the Bucks. You know, I mean, you can imagine what if you actually wound up going to the NFL and got to play for the Lions. You know, or you got to go play for the Red Wings.
No, it is neat. I mean, the Lions actually drafted 2 players from the University of Michigan, so not a far transition for some of those guys. Yeah. So and people can say what they want about Jameis Winston. If you guys get the right people around him, he's a really good quarterback and has a lot of talent. And I want to root for the guy. I think even though he's had the off-field issues at Florida State, I think he's got talent, and I think he can be a great player in the league, and hopefully we can see that for you guys.
And that's one of those things. It's what I like about our general manager, Jason Light, said is, you know, you have to ask your question: is this a maturity issue with a player, or is it a character issue? And with Jameis, they were very clearly saying that was just a maturity issue. You grow out of that. You can be taught that. You know, it wasn't his character; it's not who he was. And same thing with a lot of other players. So. So you know that's what's going to be there. So man, welcome. I'm going to go ahead and say welcome to the Tampa Bay area, and I think for Christmas I'll be sending you your very own Bucks jersey if you don't have one already. By the time we get to that spot, but hey, why don't we get into the content we're actually talking about in this podcast? Well, before we get to a little bit into that, JD, for those of the people out there who don't know what In Session Film is, the podcast there, the website. Why don't you tell us a little bit about what you guys have going on over there?
Yeah, so we do 2 shows every week that we release on Monday and Fridays, and our main shows are released every Monday, and we talk about a new release of some sort, and going off of that, we have some sort of top 3 that is inspired by our main review, and then we throw in some other film-related discussion, and for our Friday shows, it kind of contain it a little bit more to like indie films and like the smaller releases, and also just kind of older and classic films that we don't have time for on our main show. So that's kind of the duality there of both of our shows, and it's a lot of fun. And if you want to check out the show, you can see everything on our website at insessionfilm.com.
Yeah, and I would highly recommend everybody goes out there and takes a look at the website, subscribe to the podcast, listen to it, leave them a review.
Yeah.
These guys are great, JD. I've listened to a lot of podcasts. I've listened to a lot of other movie podcasts, and in my opinion, you're doing it great.
Thank you.
The show that you guys produce every week is of such a quality, the content, the message that goes out, and nothing against a lot of these other guys, because there's a lot of great ones that are out there, but in my mind, you guys are one of the best ones that are out there.
Thank you.
You know, as you mentioned, you open up the show with, you know, kind of your main content, the main review of what you guys are doing, and then you move into a top 3. My listeners should probably be familiar with that little aspect, you know, and then closing out the show with another discussion segment that maybe somehow is or isn't really related to what you guys had. So it's a great podcast, guys. Everybody go out there and check it out. But for today, JD, you guys reviewed this tiny little film that came out a couple weekends ago.
Yeah.
It was directed by these brothers, the Russo brothers.
Yeah.
For this small little independent studio, Marvel Studios.
Marvel.
It was Captain America Civil War. And so today, JD, I thought we'd bring you on for our very first bonus content episode for all the Tampa Bay Buccaneers fans out there who also happen to be Marvel fans. I thought we'd just kind of give our take and talk about a little bit about what Civil War is. Now, for anyone who's out there listening, I'm going to go ahead and say this is a spoiler-filled podcast. If you're listening to this bonus content about Civil War and you have not yet seen the movie 2 weeks after its release, I don't know what's wrong with you. and you should go watch the movie. You can pause this and go watch the movie and come back to it, or you can just listen to us. But this is your last warning, your only warning that there will be spoilers. So, JD, I want to take whatever cap or filter you may have off. We don't have to worry about that. We can just talk freely about the film. And we'll get into it. So, JD, with that, why don't you go ahead and kick us off, man? Tell us what were your thoughts on Civil War?
Yeah, so I was a big fan of the film, and a lot of it, I think, has to go down to the Russo brothers and their direction and just how concise, how calculated they were, but how also just kind of how focused they were able to contain everything, which is impressive given the amount of characters in the film. But I kind of want to backtrack a little bit because for some of your listeners, they may or may not be aware that this is actually the Russo brothers' second adventure into the Marvel Cinematic Universe. They first came into the universe with Captain America Winter Soldier a few years ago, which completely changed the game for the MCU.
Yeah, it did.
You know, and it was such it wasn't just that it was a game changer, but the way they were able to subvert genre expectations and give us a riveting spy thriller on top of a superhero film was absolutely incredible. And with Civil War, they're kind of doing something similar where they're deconstructing the superhero genre. They're giving us lots of fun action without using large scale destruction. And my favorite part is they give us a very fascinating villain that avoids cliche villain tropes. And we can get further into that, but that is certainly one of the big highlights of this film for me. And as a result, it's maybe my favorite Marvel film they've done to date. And I would argue this is one of the better comic book movies we've seen, period. It's absolutely incredible. I mean, again, a lot of it goes to the direction, the balance they're able to bring, just the fun that they're able to bring, but also the stakes, the emotional stakes of this movie is quite wonderful. And it may start off a little slow for some audiences, but it builds so well, and they take their time with it. And I think that's what's fascinating. There's large stretches of this movie where there isn't action. It's a lot of building up the characters, building up what they're fighting for and why they're fighting each other. The thing that Batman versus Superman failed to do earlier this year was establish the motivations of their characters. And in this film, you're dealing with a lot more than just two, and yet you still feel the motivations of everyone involved. And that is just bonkers crazy to do. And the fact that they were so successful in it is quite something.
Right. And, you know, JD, I would 100% wholeheartedly agree with you on everything that you just said. I thought Civil War, I sent out this tweet real shortly after, you might have seen it, where I said that Captain America Civil War succeeded everywhere where Batman versus Superman failed.
Pretty much.
It just did. Absolutely. I mean, and here's the thing. I didn't hate Batman versus Superman like you did, or Brendan, your co-host there at In Session Film.
Yeah,
I didn't love it by any stretch of the imagination. I kind of gave it a, it wasn't as bad as I expected, but man, this movie was just great on every single level, and well, I could basically spend the next couple of minutes just re-saying everything that you did, but you pretty much just said it. That was it, and you know, no, I agree with you. I actually went back and I've seen the movie 4 times now.
Wow.
in the theater, and not by intention. It was more like I went to see it because I wanted to see it, and then these people wanted to see it, so I said sure, and then somebody else wanted to see it, so I said sure, and then it's just how it worked out. But each time I've watched it, I was kind of watching for those pacing issues, and honestly, I think the movie moves better the more you see it.
Yeah,
it really like each time it's just like it just flows even that much smoother every single time I saw it. So, and the balance, the balance between what you're kind of calling the slow parts, it's versus like the action parts, and I can't even call those slow parts because even though there might not have been a lot of action, as you say, the stakes in those scenes were so high where they were going with those. There wasn't a whole lot of what I'd call bathroom breaks. In this movie, because if you miss this part, man, you're missing a key part of the movie. Before they go, so I loved this film, and it certainly, I think, for me, ranks as my favorite Marvel movie to date. And I know a lot of people there. I don't want to say a lot of people. There is a small segment out there that seem to be kind of boo-hooing this movie a little bit, and I don't understand that.
I don't understand it either. I think there's a certain contingent of people out there that may be envious of Marvel's success and perhaps want to kind of deflate that. I don't know. I don't know what their motives are, and I don't see their criticisms by any means. And to kind of reiterate what I mean by when the film slows down, I don't see that as a bad thing. Like you're saying, we certainly see the emotional stakes of the film, and simultaneously, the film is setting up exposition that is needed. But the time that the Russos pause to reflect on what the moral dilemma is gives. It sets the motivations for the characters out in such a way that is so easy to understand. And it even goes down to characters you don't see on screen a whole lot, like the William Hurt character, who isn't in the film a ton. And it would have been so easy for the film to villainize him, but they don't. That scene where he's kind of laying out his plan to the Avengers with the Sokovia Accords, when he's talking, he's pretty reasonable. He makes a lot of sense. And I think that's the whole irony of this film, is that even though by the end you probably know where you should stand, but for the majority of the movie, both sides are right. You don't know which side to stand on. And the fact that they're able to lay out both sides so effectively on top of the Zemo character, which is something else we need to get into.
Oh yeah, we will.
The way they lay that out is just as effectively. But that's why those slow moments are so necessary here. And again, they may be quote unquote slower, but the tension and the suspense is always there. You're always on the edge of the seat, even when there isn't a ton of action. And I think because of that, the 2.5 hours that this film flew by for me.
Yeah, it doesn't feel like 2.5 hours unless you've just had a big 64-ounce soda. You've been in the middle and you're like, oh crap, I really got to go.
For sure.
Yeah, it was just one of the, I mentioned earlier that I thought this movie succeeded everywhere that Batman versus Superman failed. And one of the reasons why I've thought about this each time I've seen the movie now is, with Batman versus Superman. Oh, by the way, I'm going to spoil this one for you too. The neat thing about a Batman versus Superman movie is we've had this question for years, right? Who would win in a fight between Batman and Superman? And this movie just kind of takes that age-old question and puts it on film in front of us so we could see it. But, so they go through their fighting, and then all of a sudden they get in the middle of their fighting and they go, oh, we really shouldn't be fighting each other. Now let's turn our attention to this other villain over here. And this is kind of the Marvel Universe analog of, well, who would win if we fought each other? If our good, that's really what this is. And we didn't lose that. They didn't lose that question for the movie. So like from the beginning all the way to the end of the movie, literally the end of the movie, it's our guys fighting each other. There wasn't this other villain that they had to team up for and then go fight alongside each other with at the end. Even when it went from the group of the Avengers to as a whole, all the way down to kind of the captains between Captain America and Iron Man, when they were just solo fighting each other.
Mhm.
You know, and I loved that it didn't lose its focus as a film. It knew what it was trying to do. It knew what it was trying to put out. And as you said, the moral of who's right and who's wrong, you know, it made me think a lot of. You remember that movie Crimson Tide
Oh,
from a
yeah.
bunch of
Yeah,
years
yeah,
ago, where
yeah,
in
yeah.
the very end of the movie, Jason Robards, who's the admiral, is looking
Mhm.
at this captain and this first officer who have just gone back and forth on this mutiny type deal.
Yeah.
And he says, you know, the line he says, he's like, you are both right and you are both wrong.
Yeah.
And that's the case of what's actually happening here
Exactly.
with Iron Man and Captain America. Is they're both right. They both have a point.
Yeah.
And you know, while Captain America Civil War the movie is not the same thing as Civil War the Marvel comic book event,
Yeah.
because the storyline is actually very different between the two.
Yeah.
The heart of the issue of what they're trying to get at, which is a who is right, and the answer is really they're both right, is still there, and that,
Yeah.
that plays through, and that's the part. And I think that's why we who are Marvel fans love what Marvel Studios is doing, is they're keeping the heart of what's true. You can't translate 60 years of comic book stories into a 2-hour film, you know.
Yeah,
But they're
sure.
maintaining the heart of what's true, and it resonates with us, the viewer. So
Yeah.
man, let me ask you a little bit more about kind of the technical, the directing choices maybe that the Russo brothers made. One of the things I was noticing, particularly as they were filming the fights, was it seemed like the film seemed to move into a high frame rate and then would back out into a more normal frame rate. Did you notice that at all as you were watching, and how they choreographed their fights and set up the cameras and just kind of the technical aspect of how this film was put together?
Yeah, I did notice that some of the frame rate would change during the big action scenes, just because a lot of it is CG. So they would change it slightly just to kind of, fit the aesthetic of what they were, creating for those big action sequences. But for the most part, it's so fluid and very effective. And I do think they use the camera in somewhat of a conventional way. And given the amount of CG, you kind of have to do that. But at the same time, they're able to take shaky cam and they're able to slow it down in a way, or at least steady it just enough so you can feel and understand everything that's happening in those action sequences, which is so wonderful because there's a lot of moving pieces. Like at the airport fight, for example, you have giant Ant-Man and Spider-Man swinging around, and they'll
Right.
cut to Iron Man and War Machine. There's a lot of moving pieces there, but the way they're able to use the camera to kind of give you like a medium scope and then some really wonderful close-ups that I think are great, and they never lose track of where they're at and what they're doing. And my favorite part about what they're doing technically, and this includes some of the CG and effects, is that they contain all of the action. So again, I feel like at the heart of this movie there is that moral dilemma that you were just talking about, but the Russos are also deconstructing the genre. So they are very meticulous in making sure that there isn't quote unquote large scale destruction. So when we're at this airport fight and there's a lot going on, there's obviously a lot of characters there. There's really not much destruction to the airport. The airport is still standing afterwards. The only thing
Mostly.
that's real,
Mostly.
mostly, I mean, there's some broken windows and a few things that you'll have to replace. There's a plane that pretty much gets destroyed, but outside of that,
Well,
The-
there is one thing. Just because you're bringing it up, the Vision completely obliterated the control tower of this airport.
okay, yeah,
I
so
mean, he
there's-
obliterated that thing.
he did, and that is honestly the worst of it.
It is.
In
It
the
is.
in the entire movie, outside of one moment with Scarlet Witch at the beginning, where there's part of a building is blown up, but that is very deliberate because that is obviously the last straw before the governments get involved and
They
the
say no
Sokovia
more,
Wars have.
right.
So that is very deliberate. But outside of that moment, all of the other action of the movie is very, very much contained without using large scale destruction. It's supposed to kind of subvert those kind of expectations.
Right.
And from a technical standpoint, I think they do a great job of making sure that you do feel that containment, and at the same time making sure that the action is fun and there are stakes involved. And I think you do feel all of that, and they do a great job with it.
Well, let's go over to that. Kind of leave the technical piece behind, and let's go over to the story pieces a little bit, just because we're delving into those areas, and I want to jump into that. So certainly at the beginning of the movie, they have this bomb go off that destroys what looked to be several floors of a building, at least the corner of a building where different people died, and that certainly was the catalyst that led us into the nations of the earth kind of going, okay, New York got blown up, DC got blown up, Seoul got blown up, Sokovia got turned upside down. Like, something has to be done here. This is not okay. And that, of course, leads us into the main motivation of the fight. One of the things that really, I think on the first watch, particularly when you get to that airport scene, is it was such a spectacle to watch our heroes fight each other. And there was this, like, they were trying to hurt each other, but they were trying not to hurt each other at the same time.
Sure.
You know, this conflict back and forth, because they're still, and it's one of the things I loved about the film was, while they may have been miffed at each other and they may have been on opposite sides, you could still tell they all very much cared for each other. They were all still very much, they had a history with each other, and this was painful, not just physically, but also emotionally, to have to be going through through these fights with each other. And even as you talk about, like, the airport, and there is one other piece of destruction that happens in the film, which would be when they're first going to get Bucky Barnes, and they have that sequence where they're running through what I can only imagine is the world's longest tunnel. Because I don't know what speed they were traveling at, but for the number of minutes they were in the tunnel, that's a long tunnel. But at the very end, and this was really more on Bucky's fault. This is more Bucky's fault than it was anyone else's. But, he throws a little bomb and actually destroys the exit to the tunnel. And that's just going to screw up traffic for a few days. I mean, that's just not okay. And I don't even know what country they were in at that point. It doesn't matter. But so you had that, and then you had, and let's face it, you knock down the control tower of an airport, that airport is out of commission for a while. And if that was a major airport, so you have these things.
But the airport doesn't have to be rebuilt, and I think that's really the point of anything. Like, there is going to be destruction with this kind of action. I don't want that to be misinterpreted or misunderstood, because there is. There's definitely destruction, but there isn't a New York City being destroyed. There's not a Sokovia, a whole city being lifted from the earth and completely obliterated. Like, the world, the literal world isn't under fire here. Like, like you're saying, it's a control tower, it's a little highway, it's a small part of a building, it's a car. Like, it's so contained in comparison, and that's more of where I was coming from with that. If that makes sense.
Right, and that's where we need to go, because you look at let's take the airport scene. What are the motivations for them fighting? I mean, Team Captain America is just trying to get to a helicopter or a Quinjet. Like, they're just trying to escape, and Team Iron Man is just trying to stop them from escaping. Like, that's all that's their main motivation in that particular moment. And it was so interesting. But as a fan, watching the spectacle on the screen, it was okay that was like, that was the reason for what they were doing, because it was fun just to watch.
And can I speak to that real fast? Because, part of the brilliance of this film, as we've been saying, especially when you compare it to Batman versus Superman, where you don't understand the motivations of the characters.
Right.
You're right in the sense that we understand Tony's point of view and why he is wanting to catch Cap. And at the same time, we understand why Cap is wanting to get Bucky out of there, and they're trying to find these other Winter Soldiers. But it's more complicated than that, because you understand the motivation of Black Panther, who is really just there to capture Bucky. You understand the motivation of Spider-Man, who's really just there to impress Tony Stark. That's all he cares for.
Because he got invited.
Exactly. Vision is mostly there to make sure that Scarlet Witch is taken care of. And I find that really fascinating, that even though you understand the overall scope of each side and what the main objective is, but each character within the teams have their own personal motivations as well, which is just as fleshed out as the overarching motivation of each team.
Absolutely. And and you touch on something there, talking about the relationship that's obviously developing between Vision and the Scarlet Witch, which in the comic books they get married and they're married for quite a long time. And so it's fun as an old school Marvel fan to see that beginning to develop. And it's one of those places where even I think a Marvel movie is doing it better than a previous Marvel movie. One of my biggest complaints with Age of Ultron was where this seeming relationship with Black Widow and the Hulk, or rather Bruce Banner, I guess, is all of a sudden it just seems to pop out of nowhere.
Man, and that was one of my favorite parts of that movie.
Well, no, I mean it was great. It just didn't feel as earned in that moment. Like it felt like that should have been in a different place. Like I was okay with the relationship in those two. It just didn't. They're in that opening fight and she's kind of doing this like calming effect on him towards the end, but there was no lead up to that.
I agree.
That was the part that kind of jarred me in that. But I love how they're developing the Vision and Scarlet Witch, because you certainly can see that there's something there between those. Can
we talk about Zemo now?
I would love to. Let's get into that. So you guys spent a crap ton of time in your podcast talking about Zemo, and so here's my question for you, JD. Zemo, was he the villain of this movie or no?
No, he's not the villain of this movie. But that's what I find so brilliant about it. Earlier you were talking about how in Batman versus Superman, Doomsday comes out of nowhere. He's not established really at all, and if it kind of comes to a point where Batman and Superman kind of stop their fight to go fight Doomsday, and it just isn't really it isn't developed very well. And you went on to say from that in this film, there isn't really that kind of dynamic, in that this film focuses on the fight between Team Cap and Team Iron Man. And I do agree with that. But the brilliance of this movie for me is that there is a villain lurking in the background, kind of pulling the strings a little bit, and you don't notice it. It's not on the surface. And I find it absolutely brilliant. On our show, I said it was borderline laughable to call Zemo a villain, and I do stick to my guns with that because
now wait a minute, because this is the guy that just because he needed to get the info that he needed, he blew up the UN and killed a bunch of people.
Yes,
right. So that's who we are, and you're telling me he's not the villain. So that's interesting.
Well, okay, well, in comparison, Tony Stark created a monster that ended up blowing up a whole city. So you tell me which one's worse.
Fair enough. Okay. All right, JD. So let's get to it. Who is it you guys were saying was the real villain of this film?
So again, I'm not saying that he doesn't do villainous things, but at the root of Zemo, he is really more of a victim that is masked as a villain. And I think, again, we've been talking about how all of the characters and their motivations are fleshed out. And I feel the same thing for Zemo. This is a father, a husband, a soldier that had a family that was killed by something that Tony Stark created. And he has a beautiful scene where he goes on to talk about how, yes, they stopped Ultron, but there was all this collateral damage and they went home. And he had to find his family's dead bodies days later after the fact. And I found that really poignant. And I love Daniel Bruhl's performance. I think he's quite wonderful. And I went extensively on our show to talk about how, even though he is pulling the strings in the background, speaking of Zemo, the true villain of this film, and I mean this in all seriousness, as silly as it sounds, that the true villain of the film is guilt. It is an emotion, and not just guilt, but the potential for guilt, and also heartache. It drives every action in this film, from Tony Stark to Steve Rogers to Zemo. And again, I could go even further into how that emotion affects Black Panther and Winter Soldier and Scarlet Witch and Vision and even Spider-Man. They take a moment in this film to ask Spider-Man, why do you fight? And Peter Parker's answer is essentially, well, I have these powers. If I don't use them, then I'm wasting them. Meaning that he would feel guilty about wasting his talents if he wasted them. So pretty much every character in this film on some level displays guilt or the potential of it, and how that has affected them in some way. And I find that so rich as it relates to the context of this story. It's just so brilliant. And on top of what Zemo is doing as far as how he feels about this, I also love that he's fully aware of his place in this. And I think that's just as important because even though he is motivated and he is hurting, he also understands that he can't compete with the Avengers. Again, one of my favorite moments of the scene of the movie is where he's talking about how he's just a soldier. He can't compete with them. So he sets in motion the series of events, and we've touched on a few of them, that causes the rift with the Avengers. And at the root of all that, it is that guilt and heartache. And I find that so fascinating. All Zemo does in this movie is he pokes holes in the Avengers, and then he lets the Avengers kind of feel those holes and then take it out on each other.
Oh, well, sure. Because as soon as Captain America and Iron Man started fighting, he just smiled and walked away.
Exactly.
He was convinced they were going to kill each other, and he just walked away glad that his job was done. And even when they didn't, and he was later captured, and they say, how do you feel about failing in your mission? And he just smiles at the Martin Freeman character and says, "Did I?"
That's what I find so brilliant about it. All he is doing is taking those emotions and cultivating it in the heroes, and then letting them, take it out on each other. Because, I guess for a few specifics, he's the one that ultimately puts a target on Winter Soldier's back when he blows up this building as they're going to sign the Sokovia Accords. And again, he's certainly framing Winter Soldier, but by doing that, it causes Black Panther to get into the fold a little bit. And then that forces Captain America to defend Bucky at all costs. And then when we get to the end of the movie, he's the one that pushes Tony over the edge when he finds out that it was Bucky that killed his parents. And that just leads to an incredibly intense and emotional final fight that is just breathtaking to watch.
Right. And which, by the way, let me touch on that real quick. To go back to the Russo brothers and their storytelling and what makes this such a great movie and what a great story to watch is just the way they wove their story from the beginning, from the opening shot of the film, where they show us this scene from the motorcycle, the scene from 1991, and you don't know what it is, but they show it to you a couple times throughout the film. And then they even bring out this scene at the beginning of the movie where Iron Man is remembering a time from his youth before his parents died. And they show on a storytelling level, they don't just bring this piece out at the very end and, oh, looks like the Winter Soldier killed my parents. Like, they showed it to us throughout the movie, but they kept it cloaked in mystery enough that we didn't put it together until it all came out. And it's that's what makes the Russo brothers such great storytellers, and that's why I'm so glad they're part of the MCU and that they've taken over, particularly even Captain America, because his stories can be a little tricky on an emotional level, and they've done such a fantastic job with really the last two movies, which we could almost retitle this one, instead of Captain America, just be Winter Soldier 2, Civil War.
You could, and I agree with you. I mean, the pacing of that mystery and how they unravel that, I thought was really well timed, and it's so impressive because, as we've been saying, there's so much going on in this movie. There are so many characters, and yet when that revelation comes. And part of this is also Robert Downey Jr.'s performance. When that moment hits Downey Jr.'s face, there's a wonderful close-up on him where he is just devastated. And you're right, even though they have been teasing it, you may not know. And I certainly fell for the twist as well. And I loved it. And again, I love how all of it ties back to Zemo's motives and how he is just kind of pulling the strings from behind the scenes. All he's doing is tapping into Tony's emotion. And that's it. Like, he's tapping into Tony's guilt and his potential for guilt, and he was going to use that as a weapon to kill Bucky and to kill Captain America. And I just find the writing of that brilliant, and as you were just saying, the Russos' direction and how they execute that idea is incredible. And that's why, again, as silly as it sounds, I really do feel like the true villain of this film is that emotion. It's at the centerpiece of every action in this movie, and how Zemo just is a vehicle for that.
Right.
I love, and I think Daniel Bruhl is wonderful. And you're right though that if that emotion is used as a vehicle to focus the fight on the Avengers. So it's never that the fight is never taken. It's never going anywhere. It's not like Batman and Superman go to fight someone else altogether. It is always Team Cap versus Team Iron Man, but there is a third party that is there and pulling the strings. And I just love how that's handled in this film. It's incredible.
Well, I'll tell you what, JD, before we leave Zemo, just one more piece I want to bring up about him that had me thinking. I remember when I first heard you kind of unpacking this a little bit on your all's podcast. And it was even just the idea that Zemo is not that bad of a guy. I mean, like he can do some pretty ruthless stuff, like how he killed that Hydra agent. I've never seen that. Hold a guy upside down in a sink and let the sink overflow. Like, that's pretty badass. You know,
it is.
on a I'm gonna freak you out now kind of level. But even like to the point where we talk about what you guys refer to as the red herring, which are these other Winter Soldiers that are there. And, you know, they spend this time kind of setting up how bad these other Winter Soldiers can be, which, and then we get there and he shot them all. And he's like, what, do you think I want those guys running around this world too? No. Like, I don't want those guys out here, which on the one hand, there's a little bit of me that was kind of miffed because they unveiled that there's all of these other Winter Soldiers out there, at least these other, 5 or 6, and they're even worse than Bucky is. And then they just like shot him. Like, I felt like they could have saved that in their pocket for a future movie, but I do think it went to show how not bad Zemo really is.
Yeah, you know, here's the crazy thing about this. If you went to watch a completely separate movie altogether, and Zemo was the main character, and you realize he's a good guy, he's a soldier, he certainly has some military training, and there's this terrible accident that happens that's outside of his control, right? This terrorist attack essentially kills his family, and he kind of goes on this revenge quest. If you didn't know that it was Iron Man, if you didn't know that it was Captain America that he was after, you would be rooting for him if he was the main character in another movie.
You know, I'm pretty sure you're pretty much describing every Denzel Washington movie we've seen. I think is what you're talking about here.
Pretty much. And again, I love that. I love that you're able to sympathize and understand, and especially when you put it in the context of you know, what he's doing really isn't any worse than what the Avengers have already done in terms of destruction and death and devastation. Like, in fact, you know, you could, if you're gonna weigh it on a scale, what he does in comparison might not be as bad. I mean, as I mentioned, he certainly does some terrible things that causes some collateral damage and some death for sure, but so of the Avengers. And in his quest for vengeance, he scales it down and is mostly interested in the emotions, and he turns the emotions against one another. That's really what he's after more than anything else, which is why I love that scene as well that you're talking about, where he shoots those Winter Soldiers. He doesn't give a crap about them either. What he cares about is how Tony is going to emotionally react to this video he's about to show him. That's really what he cares about. And again, if that was a Denzel movie, but Zemo was in place of Denzel, you're going to root for him. Yeah, absolutely.
That's interesting. Well, let's move on from Zemo. We got a couple of new characters, a couple of new heroes who will eventually join the Avengers if they stay true to anything whatsoever within the comic books. And let's talk about those guys. Let's start with Black Panther. What'd you think of Chadwick Boseman and his performance and just the writing and the introduction of this character of the Black Panther?
Chadwick Boseman is awesome. Incredible. Every piece of dialogue out of his mouth I thought was completely badass. Just so great. And Chadwick Boseman is an actor that has really grown on me over the last couple of years, and I just feel like he owns this role. Every time he is on screen, he is a presence, and I love that accent. I love the aesthetics created around him. And I love the passion that he displays. I mean, obviously, once his father is killed, there's certainly that emotional turn that takes over. Again, I don't need to beat that to death, but
Right.
of course, it fits into what I've been talking about with the movie. But Chadwick Boseman never goes away from that motivation. Every time he's on screen, he's after Bucky. He's after this vengeance, and it's great. There's a really funny scene that I think depicts Black Panther so well, where when they're at the airport fight, Hawkeye is fighting him or whatever, and Hawkeye's like, "Hi, I don't think we've ever met. I'm Clint." And and Black Panther just responds, "I don't care.
I don't care." And then he cuts his bow in half with his little tentacle claw
It's
things.
so great. But that's
I don't care.
it was just such a great moment that reflects who Black Panther is. And yeah, I love them. I cannot wait to see this Black Panther movie.
Yeah, it was real interesting. I got to admit, I did not read much of the comic books of the Avengers, and I wasn't that familiar with Black Panther until a couple of years ago when the animated series of Earth's Mightiest Heroes came on. Which I think Arcturus had mentioned that on your
Yes,
old
he did.
podcast.
Yeah.
And if you've not watched it, go do it. It's really great. I think it only lasted like 2 seasons, but it's a really fantastic series. It's on Netflix, or at least it was. But in that one, they have Black Panther as one of the Avengers, and it was so striking to me just how well written this character is, and how true to the sense of even what they did in the animated series, and from the bits and pieces that I remember of Black Panther as a kid. Because here's this guy who, he is an African king now. And he was really the wisest of all of our Avengers, the same, and that even comes through in this movie where he's at the UN, and you kind of see him interacting with Scarlet Witch a little bit, and all the way up to his climactic scene with Daniel Brühl in the snow, where he says, "You've let vengeance consume you. They're letting vengeance consume them, and I'm no longer going to let it consume me."
Yeah.
He's so wise, and it's the way that I think only an African king could say it.
Well, and the crazy thing in the middle of that is from that moment at the UN until he has that scene with Daniel Brühl, he's emotionally just as much in the mix. And even though he is wise, he's just as emotional.
Sure.
He's a lot of his
human.
Exactly. I love how they show that he's just as human, but at the end of the day, he is going to make those wise choices that he needs to make. And I agree with you. That's Brun, and I love that scene with Daniel Brühl, and I love how Black Panther's arc very much mirrors Zemo's. They're pretty much the exact same arc, but at the end, as you said, he makes the wise choice that he needs to make. It's great writing. I agree.
Right. And and one of the things that I loved about this was the juxtaposition at the very end and the extra scenes credit. Because what struck me, even it didn't really hit me, I think, until my last viewing of this film, was, so here's Black Panther, who was sort of part of Team Iron Man. Like if you had to put him on one of the two, he was definitely on that side of the ball. Though he was kind of more of an independent out there running.
Yeah,
but he was part of that, and he is part of the international community that has imposed these Sokovia Accords and these restrictions on the Avengers. But yet he winds up harboring Bucky.
He does.
And maybe even what I have gone on to call the secret Avengers. Which I think might be, now that the Avengers are kind of split into two teams, I think that might be what we see with, going forward is the secret Avengers. And it's almost like he's got this one face of the international policy of how they handle the Avengers. And I don't know if he's actually going to harbor the rest of the team or if it's just Bucky, but he is certainly in contact with them. And he certainly knows where they are and what they're up to, and he's with them. And it was just such an amazing thing that how could you not see that cougar panther thing at the very end of the film and not just get so excited?
Oh my God, I know.
for Ryan Coogler's film coming out, which oh man.
The cast lined up for that film is
though they've been announcing it this week.
Lupita
Nyong'o, I can never say her name right.
Lupita Nyong'o.
Who's the other guy who just signed on?
It's like right there on the tip of my tongue too.
Creed, the guy from Creed, Michael B. Jordan.
Michael B. Jordan. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, so to see those guys and try to figure out where they're going to now come into the fold is just going to be amazing. So yeah, Black Panther certainly. I saw your tweet coming out of it. It said Captain America: Civil War. Oh my God, Black Panther and Spider-Man. Holy cow! Like it was something of that nature. So so there's Black Panther. So we got another new hero. Speaking of which is one that is arguably the most anticipated hero to join the MCU, which is Spider-Man. What'd you think of the introduction of Spider-Man into the MCU?
Well, for a little bit of context, Spider-Man is my favorite comic book character of all time.
Which makes you correct on every level.
Yes. Love this character. And as far as the other two iterations we've seen, I think the Andrew Garfield character, I thought he was a great Spider-Man, but I thought he was a pretty terrible Peter Parker. He just didn't fit that nerdy factor. Andrew Garfield's just too cool. He looks like a model. So he's not Peter Parker. Where Tobey Maguire, I thought, was a great Peter Parker, but didn't quite fit the Spider-Man mold. He didn't quite have that smart alecky kind of dialogue that you're used to hearing from Spider-Man. So I was excited to see what Tom Holland brought to this role. I'm a fan of Tom Holland. I know he's going to be very new to a lot of people. I was familiar with him before, and I think he is the perfect balance of both. The moment we see him in New York in the apartment, he immediately has this chemistry with Tony Stark, and which is a lot of fun. But he just has a lot of those nerdy isms that the character would certainly portray, and he even talks about some of the science and schooling and why that matters to him. And at the same time, when we actually see Spider-Man in this movie, when Peter Parker is in the suit, he is freaking Spider-Man. He has the dialogue, the smart alecky witticism that the character is all about.
And
Tom Holland nails it. He does. He talks a lot. Yeah, just perfect. He was just so much fun, and I feel like they nailed everything about the character that I look for in it. So even though he's only in the film like maybe 20-25 minutes, and he's in the film a lot, when he's there, we do see him a lot, and I feel like they used him impeccably. I loved it.
Yeah, he was really great, and I think that's a great the way you guys kind of said Tobey Maguire was a good Peter Parker, not really that great of a Spider-Man. Andrew Garfield was the vice versa of that, and Tom Holland really is bringing the best of both worlds into this. And I couldn't be more happy with Tom Holland coming in with his performance. And like you, Spider-Man is my favorite character in all of Marvel, as I think he generally is. Like
for a lot of people,
for most people, he is, and rightly so. Because certainly he brings in the most flawed aspects, which is what Marvel characters are. Is
so relatable.
Exactly. Let me ask you this: what do you think about Aunt May in this movie?
Well, this is the whole thing that I had a conversation with some people on social media about.
I think I might have been one of those people, actually.
Yeah, like a lot of people seem to have problems with the fact that she's quote unquote young. And I know that in the comics, she is portrayed to be a little bit older, as we've seen in the previous Spider-Man movies. But here, maybe my life is different than everyone else's, but when I was 16 and 17 years old, my aunts were not 60 or older. Like they were 40. They were 45 years old max. I mean, unless you come from a large family that has, you have lots of uncles and lots of aunts and lots of cousins, then that's, I can certainly see that. Or if there's just a huge time gap between siblings, because, my wife is like, she's like 12 years younger than her brother. Like there's a huge gap between. So Sammy will kind of have, my son will kind of have that, he will have an older aunt kind of thing. So, but in terms of, normalcy, I feel like most people do not have aunts when you're 16 years old anyway, to be that old. So I feel like it's kind of realistic. So
Right.
you know, people can kind of calm down. I know it's different than the comics, but in terms of math, it makes sense.
It makes way more sense. And yeah, no, I loved her, and I am so excited for Marissa Tomei to play this character. I think
Me too. She's
she nails it in a way that Kirsten Dunst never nailed Mary Jane in the original Spider-Mans. You know, and I loved I forget her name, the lady that played Aunt May in those Sam Raimi Spider-Mans, the older lady. She was great, and she really captured, I think, what the comic book character of Aunt May was.
Sure, and that makes sense.
But Marissa Tomei is going to bring a whole new element that just fits, and it's just going to make sense in this Spider-Man. And I'm super excited. I'm super excited to find out about the Uncle Ben character. You know, obviously that whole situation has happened now. And are they, or maybe it hasn't, and maybe Uncle Ben is going to translate to somebody else. You know, they give that role. But I'm interested to find out what's going to happen as far as that whole aspect, because we're not getting the origin story, and we don't need it, but it would be nice to see a picture.
We got the origin story in Civil War. We got it in 60 seconds, where Peter Parker tells Tony Stark, it's a long story. I got the science down. I did it that whole sequence, and the way they did that is exactly what we needed. Like,
it's all we needed.
We all know the story, right? We all know it. We don't need to see it again. So when Peter Parker's just like, I made all of that. Don't worry, it's a long story. I'll tell you some other time. That was perfect. So and I think part of the brilliance of that scene too. And I think the Uncle Ben stuff has happened, because the way Peter reacts in that, he does kind of have this facade of, you know, with great power comes great responsibility. That's what I love so much about that whole football dialogue that he spouted off there, where he's like, I want to play football, but I can't because I couldn't do it before. Right. So again, in essence, that is great power comes great responsibility. Right. Or, you know, when he goes to talk about why he needs to take advantage of these powers, it's the same idea. So I think all of that has happened. I do think they'll have a nod to Uncle Ben, and probably a nod to his quote unquote origins in Spider-Man Homecoming, but it'll be very similar to what we saw in Civil War, where they're going to spend a minute on it, two tops, and we're going to move on.
And that's all they need to. And, you know, and here's the thing. I was, you mentioned that I was a little disappointed that we didn't hear the line, great power, you know, with great power comes great responsibility, come out of Peter's mouth in this movie. Like just a smidge disappointed that we didn't hear that. Because they talked
about that, though. I'm sure
they had to have been a deliberate choice that they said, let's not do that just yet, which is the only thing that gives me pause that maybe the Uncle Ben stuff hasn't happened, or maybe Uncle Ben's not going to be a character, and that role is going to get transitioned. You know, I know some people are speculating on the death of Iron Man coming up, and with Iron Man being in Homecoming, maybe it actually comes from him. Like, that's just speculation. There's no rumors, no nothing. That's just pure speculation.
Either way, Tony Stark is certainly going to fill that void on some level, whether it's the uncle, you know, kind of void, or some sort of fatherly void. That he's certainly going to have that mentorship with Peter Parker. So, and I'll be curious to see that dynamic. It was obviously fantastic in this film. So we get a whole movie of it. Oh,
well, there you go. Well, now one more question before we move on from Spider-Man. You know, the title to Spider-Man is Homecoming, which certainly alludes to the idea that Spider-Man is coming home to the MCU. Which is great. But, you know, homecoming was also one of the words that was used in Winter Soldier's brainwashing. Do you think there's going to be any connection with that whatsoever with the new movie, or is that just a coincidence that those two words are being used?
I was listening to the Empire Film Podcast, and the host of that show was interviewing Kevin Feige, and he asked them that exact same question. And all Kevin Feige said was, "You'll have to wait and see." So,
which could mean no, you know,
exactly. And he pretty much said it like that, as to it felt like it was indicative of it may have something to do, but it also could just be Kevin Feige, you know, playing the strings a little bit, and it may not mean anything. I don't know. That's just what he said. So who knows?
Well, interesting. Well, guys, we'll have to make sure we all tune into Spider-Man: Homecoming, which is coming out in 2017.
17. Yeah.
Gosh, man. The length of having to wait for these freaking movies is killing me, man. Before we do that, so that's it. Well, I tell you what, let's move on and talk a little bit. Now we're kind of speculating about future movies. There was some news that came out that Infinity Wars, which is the next Avengers movie coming up, and I've said we could actually retitle this movie to Winter Soldier 2: Civil War. I think we could also call it Avengers 2.5. Might be another title, but Infinity War Part 1 and Part 2 is getting a title mix-up, a title change. Talk to me about what are you anticipating with that? Is this now two separate movies, or is it still going to be one movie in two parts? What are we thinking? What are you thinking that's going to go? How they're going to do that?
Well, even before the title changes, there was already talk about how these were going to be two separate movies that would just kind of eventually tie themselves together. And I think, honestly, that's why they titled it the way they did. My guess is I feel like Marvel always knew that they were going to be two separate movies that eventually will tie together, but they wanted to have more time to kind of process what they really wanted to call them. And eventually, probably pretty soon, we're going to see what kind of direction they're going to go with that. My guess is Infinity War Part 1 is going to set up a lot of Thanos, who is going to be the main villain of the Infinity War storyline. I think we will see more of him in Guardians of the Galaxy Volume 2, which also comes out next summer. But I feel like that first one is going to set him up even further, and I think he's going to be a main focus of that. Because in the comics, this is the most powerful being in this universe. And he's also been the centerpiece of all these stinking stones we've seen throughout all these other movies.
Right.
And so I do think they're going to spend a lot of time setting him up and setting up his motivation as to why he wants all these stones and why we've seen them all in these previous films. And then I think Infinity War Part 2 is going to be where he gets all the stones, he puts his plan into motion, and the Avengers have to kind of stop him. And I think on top of what I was just saying about the setup of Thanos, I think a lot of Infinity War Part 1 is also going to be focused on the Avengers trying to cope with what just happened in Civil War. And I think that's the brilliance of actually keeping them alive. And I know that's disappointed some people that no major character died in this movie, but I think that's more powerful. If one of them dies, it's, like if Tony killed Cap, for example, all you're going to have to deal with is, Iron Man's coping of that and maybe feeling a little bit more guilty for it in the long run. But I find it more fascinating that they're alive and that they're going to have to somehow get over what just happened in this movie to defeat Thanos, who just happens to be the most powerful being in this universe. They are the most broken and fractured they've ever been. How are they going to get over that to face off against Thanos? I find that way more fascinating than if one of them got killed. So
now, JD, I don't know that they're as fractured as you say they are. And you talked a bit about this a little bit on your podcast, and it was one of the things that was ringing around in my head. Because of that final scene that we got with the letter that Cap sent to Iron Man, which was basically a burner phone that just said, "If you need me, call. I'm still here." And so while certainly they are fractured in that they are physically separate, and one's going to be the legal team and one's going to be the illegal team, I feel like they're actually still in spirit together. Do you not get that? Do you not get that idea? Or
I don't. And I know this has been some debate, but that letter for me doesn't hold a whole lot of weight. When I see that scene right before, and we kind of alluded to it already in this conversation, but in the climax of that final fight, it gets very emotional and very, very intense. And in the climax of that fight is where Cap has his shield, and the film kind of lingers when Cap raises the shield, and there's a wonderful close up on Tony Stark's face where he realizes that this could be the end.
Right.
This could be it. And instead Cap slams it into Iron Man's chest plate, which, by the way, I think is wonderful symbolism.
Oh, sure.
But on top of that, it ends the fight, and Cap starts to walk away, and Iron Man has this really great line where he's like, "That shield doesn't belong to you. My family built that," and Cap drops the shield, which I think says a lot about his identity in that moment and his inner turmoil. And the conflict at that moment is what's resonant to me. I think the letter at the end is just reflective of Cap's personality. That is Captain America. He is going to be the one that once the emotions calm down, he's the leader. And I feel like he wants Tony to know that the bridge is available, but right now neither of them are at the bridge, and the bridge is still pretty freaking broken. I think there's going to be a lot of repair that needs to be done still. I think all the letter meant to me is that this isn't the end of the world, and at some point, if a Thanos arrives, that they can get back together. But there's still going to have to be a lot of work to be done for them to get together. So I don't feel as lighthearted as a lot of other people do about it.
That's interesting. Now, you say that because I kind of feel the opposite. I think they're a lot more together than they might seem. And I will say that, but I will also say this. If they don't do or if they do in Infinity War or some other Marvel movie what they did with Age of Ultron, I'm going to be so mad. And I'll tell you what I'm talking about is at the end of the first Avengers movie, we see all the Avengers going their separate ways. And there's this voiceover by Nick Fury saying they'll come back together when the world needs them. And so where we left them was all the Avengers were just kind of going back to their lives with where they were. And what I anticipated coming into Avengers 2 was that something would happen that would then cause them to call the Avengers back together. And instead what we got was the opening scene was all the Avengers just out on a mission.
They're already together.
They're already together. They're out on a mission. And I know if you watched Agents of S.H.I.E.L.D., there was this thing of saying it's time to call in the Avengers, and that kind of told us where they were and that they had all of that. But it was such a jarring, disappointing, like they told me at the end of Avengers that this would have to happen, and they skipped all of that and just jumped right into something. And it just jarred me. Like it wasn't what I was expecting. And if they don't do something, if where they open up with Infinity War is the teams are back together and Captain America has his shield because his shield is now in Tony Stark's possession, that's going to upset me so much because we need to see something that does bring these back together, even if it's just Tony picking up that phone and saying, "Hey, I need you guys back over here," or "Hey, we need to meet for coffee and talk this out," or something that happens. And I got to tell you, I'm a little bit worried about Infinity War because they are going to be filming these films together simultaneously, or at least back to back, from what I understand. And I'm always a little bit worried when I hear studios doing that because it so rarely works out when you have an original standalone film and then in a sequel they do them back to back, and we just have to look at The Matrix for a good example of that, or Pirates of the Caribbean, or even Back to the Future, which I didn't mind that one so much, but but I trust Kevin Feige and the Marvel people to get it right. It's just there's just a little bit that's itching at me that goes, I'm a little worried for how these next two movies are going to come together.
Well, you said it though. The key to all of this is Kevin Feige. So as long as that guy is still working there and he's alive, I feel like this is in good hands. But still, we've seen examples of where it's worked, like the Lord of the Rings movies. Not so much The Hobbit, but the Lord of the Rings movies is a great example, though, of where it's worked. And, or even the Harry Potter Part 7. At least for me,
that one worked. I'll give you that one. I think I came out of that one saying that's the first time I've seen them take a single book and split it into two movies, and I was glad that they did it.
Yeah, me too.
The first time I'd ever seen.
So it's certainly doable, and Kevin Feige at the center of all of it, I think those films will be fine. Plus, the Russos are directing it, and in the MCU, they've done nothing for me to hold out on my excitement for their movies. I thought Captain America Winter Soldier was my favorite non-Avengers movie going into Civil War. And that has now changed because my favorite non-Avengers movie, technically anyway, is Captain America Civil War, even though this is really an Avengers movie.
Avengers 2.5.
Yeah, but I guess if we're going to get technical, this is now my favorite. So my two favorite quote unquote solos in the MCU are the two Captain America movies that the Russos have done. So my excitement going into Infinity War couldn't be higher. I have no reason to not be excited. And I'll be curious to see how they handle that brokenness and that fracturedness that we do see at the end of this movie. And I guess I'm just kind of on the opposite side of you. If they do not deal with that turmoil, and if it's not as deep or as arduous as how I feel about it right now, I'll be pretty disappointed with at least the beginning of Infinity War. But I do feel like that is going to be the case, because in that same podcast I was referencing with Kevin Feige, they first interviewed the Russo brothers, and he basically reiterated everything I said on our show, where these guys are fractured and they're going to spend some time on how they cope with that. So they seem to be on the same wavelength I am.
No, that's going to be great. And I think you and I are together on that wavelength. It's just, to me, the solution is I just need to see Iron Man pick up the phone and call him, where I think you might need a little bit more drama or storytelling to get to that point.
Well, I just, here's the thing. You have two guys that were on the same team. Even though they've had their differences, they were on the same team. And I feel like what they go through emotionally in this movie, it couldn't have separated them even further unless it went to deadly levels. I just feel like they couldn't be further from one another right now. And for that conflict to be resolved in a phone call, I think would be extremely disappointing to me. I do want to see a little bit more drama, because I feel like that if that conflict was real, there's going to have to be more to it than just, a little therapy and a phone call from Tony Stark's end. Like, I just feel like they're going to have to dive deeper into that. Otherwise, I feel like the potency of Civil War actually is stifled at that point for me.
It could be very interesting. Well, JD, I've got one more question that I want to get to before we get to, I think, the big question that we just have to answer before we close out this show.
Okay.
I was reading an interview with Kevin Feige the other day where he was referencing the upcoming contracts that are going to be expiring here soon with some of these actors and their characters, which to us would ostensibly mean they either extend the contract or the character is going to be killed off. But he started kind of comparing these characters a lot to the James Bond character, where they've had multiple actors throughout the years play the same character, and saying that the character has transcended the actors.
Sure.
And he's not directly come out and said, we'll just hire a new Tony Stark or we'll just get a new Captain America. He's not said that, but he certainly has intimated towards that. How would you feel if all of a sudden in, another movie or two, we have a brand new Captain America who's in the arc supposed to be the exact same Steve Rogers? He just looks different because he just got recast in the role because they couldn't work out a contract. How would you feel about that?
It wouldn't bother me a whole lot. I mean, and there's a couple of options to that. I mean, in the comics, Falcon has been Captain America. Winter Soldier has been Captain America. So that is an option if you want to kill off Steve Rogers. But if they just want to recast someone, we've already seen that in the MCU with War Machine, with the Hulk had a different casting change, and it doesn't bother me. In fact, as much as I love the previous actors, I feel like we got an upgrade in both of those instances. I don't think replacing Chris Evans is going to be necessarily a quote unquote upgrade, because I feel like he has portrayed Steve Rogers just quintessentially. But I feel like if they get the casting right, and Marvel has freaking proved that they can do casting pretty damn well, that it's not going to bother me if all they do is recast someone in the role.
Right. Okay. Well, yeah, I don't know. It'll be interesting. I think it'd be a little jarring for me at this point.
It'll be a little jarring,
even with the Hulk, and the Rhodey character, we saw them in one movie each. You know,
that's
and
fair.
and then we've had, at this point we've had all of these movies and all of this time to get familiar with
That's
the
fair.
faces
Yeah.
and these actors and what all we have going on there. So, all right, well, JD, I've got one more question I want to ask you before we get out of here, and I'm gonna make you pick. I'm absolutely gonna make you pick. Are you Team Iron Man or are you Team Captain America? And why? I need to know why.
So I find this question fascinating, and the reason I find it so interesting, especially within the context of our conversation and the film, is that they establish and flesh out the motivations of both sides so incredibly well. And as we mentioned earlier, every side is correct. There's really no wrong answer. So I feel like what you choose as far as Team Cap or Team Iron Man, I think is pretty reflective of who you are as a person.
Fair enough.
So for what it's worth, I would be Team Iron Man.
Okay.
And for a couple different reasons. One, in the context of the film, my personal beliefs I think would to side with Tony. I feel like if I was an Avenger and we caused all this destruction, there's obviously there's the potential that we just can't control ourselves, and I feel like having a third party would be helpful in that. The other part too is when you line up Team Iron Man, it's Iron Man and Vision and Spider-Man and Black Panther and Black Widow. Yeah, I'm gonna go with them. So.
It's definitely the cool group of the
they're so great.
Yes. and honestly, who doesn't want to fight right alongside Spider-Man?
Exactly. I think
everyone else
awesome.
could. They're fine. It's Spider-Man. I'm gonna fight with Spider-Man.
I'm gonna be with Spider-Man.
Oh man, that's funny. You make a really good point of, and as we've said, both of them are right. They're both right sides, and you make a really interesting point. The one that you choose really reveals a little bit about yourself, and I think that holds true because I too would be Team Iron Man as I've thought about it. I've thought about it over the multiple watchings, and I really didn't know, whose side I would be on, but. I think it goes back to my own personal proclivities and my own personal opinions on how things should be. That I don't think people should just be without authority in their lives. I think we all need some sort of leadership, some sort of authority, and it encapsulates great to me when you watch after that opening scene and we see Scarlet Witch in her room at the compound, and you hear what the people on the TV are saying, what the newscasters are saying. It. What right does she have to act in international land?
Yeah.
And really, since the dissolution of S.H.I.E.L.D., which was kind of it was the thing that gave them the authority to go forward and do what they needed to do.
Exactly.
They've just been operating on their own. And so to have the authority and the backing of the international community behind you that all of a sudden legitimizes what you're doing. But not only that, it also gives you parameters on what you can do. Because I try to put it in the real world. Like, I've got to imagine if let's just take that opening scene. Crossbones is going in, he's getting a biological weapon. And let's just put that in terms of the police. If the police were trying to stop him, they would not chase him through a market and risk injury to a bunch of civilians. Like they would actually, at least I think they would let him go because it would cause too much collateral damage to the civilians.
Exactly.
And our heroes don't do that. They follow him in there, and you could argue that they're right because that's such a the potential of somebody having a biological weapon is so horrible. And maybe we lose a few to save many, but I just don't see that happening in the real world. And so for a team to actually have to be under authority, but to actually be given the authority by the community, I think that's just so important. And that's I think where I come down on that, and that certainly goes to my own proclivities.
And I feel like it would have an emotional influence on them as well. Like, I feel like their Team Cap is carrying the weight of every action and that they take, right? They're having to fully carry the responsibility for it. Where if you're under the UN and something happens, yes, you have to shoulder that. But I feel like emotionally, there's also a level of responsibility coming from the UN or whatever group is fostering that.
Well, that was
to
the
where
role
you're not having.
That was the role that Nick Fury played when
Exactly,
Shield was
yeah.
still around, and Shield was overseen by an international board of people. I don't know exactly who they were, where they got their authority from, but I mean that's what Nick Fury, that was his role that he played.
Yeah.
In kind of bringing them
Exactly.
together and commanding them, and you make a great point. You know, Cap is now having to take all of that on himself.
Yeah.
So
That's crazy.
yeah, it's just it's an interesting thing. Well, JD, we have I think we have Hulk smashed this topic.
Yeah, I'd say so.
into
Which is
the
ironic
ground.
because he's not in Captain America.
He is
Civil
not
War.
in, but that's okay. Because apparently, you know, he's definitely going to be in Thor Ragnarok. That's already been announced,
yes.
and Ragnarok is supposed to be happening in the timeline at the same time as all of these events that we've been seeing. So it'll be very interesting to see what happens with Ragnarok as that comes out. And you know, the Kevin Feige has said that will have the shifting impact that Winter Soldier had, which I don't know. You dissolve S.H.I.E.L.D. and show that Hydra has been a part of S.H.I.E.L.D. this whole time. I don't know how much bigger they can go.
I know.
with where they're going. But I don't know. We'll see. We'll see how that works, and I'm excited. JD, man, I want to thank you so much for taking the time to kind of come out and join me for this bonus content on what is really a football podcast, but this is the bonus side, and we've got things that we want to talk about outside of football, and it's the off season, so it gives us stuff to talk about right now.
Sure.
Man, one time, why don't you tell everybody how they can get in touch with you and where they can find you on the internet and all your podcasting information.
Yeah. Oh, first of all, thanks for having me, and thanks for letting me talk incessantly during that review. That was a lot of fun. If you want to hear more of us, you can find us at sessionfilm.com. You can find our podcast on pretty much all of the podcast platforms out there, and you can find us on social media too. Just search In Session Film, and you'll find us on Facebook and Twitter and Google Plus and YouTube. And again, everything, we have all the links to everything on our central hub at InSessionFilm.com.
Fantastic. Well, guys, I can't recommend In Session Film enough. If you're into movies like I am, go over there. They're reviewing all the latest movies that are coming out, and even some of the ones you've never heard of. I have seen so many movies that I would not otherwise see because of what I've heard these guys do on their podcast. It is fantastic. JD, as we get out of here, do you got any closing thoughts on Civil War, man?
No, other than just I loved it. If you haven't seen it, definitely go check it out. If you have seen it, go watch it again. That's what I plan on doing. So I haven't seen it 4 times like Brent, but I am dying to see it again. I loved every second of it and can't wait to see where it goes next.
Very good. Well, guys, I would echo exactly what JD says. If you haven't seen it, go see it. Go pay to go see it in the theater. It's one of those events that you will be glad that you did.
Yes.
And you don't want to just sit home and watch it on the little screen if you can at all avoid that. Well, guys, I think that's going to do it for us here at the Pewtercast Bonus Content 1. Stay tuned. Stay tuned with our podcast feed because we're going to be back with episode 3 really soon here in the off season. And guys, thank you so much for your support of this podcast. It has been blowing up, and it has been amazing just to watch. I can't believe that so many of you guys are taking the time to give us a listen. And hey, listen, do me a favor. Go back to our iTunes set. Leave us a review. Let us know what you thought of even the bonus content, or leave us a review of what you think of the main show. Would love to have your input back over there. Shoot me an email at thepewtercast@gmail.com, or you can get in touch with us on Twitter at the Pewtercast, or on Facebook.com/thepewtercast. Would love to interact with you there. We'll respond to every piece of email and any notifications that we get. We love getting in touch with you guys. Guys, thanks so much. That's going to do it for this show. We're out.